Hi, I'm Rebecca Deep, the exhibitions manager here at Visions Art Museum, and I'm standing in our galleries right now with our two exhibitions, Shifting Tides by SAQA and Connecting Threads by Beth Blankenship. As you can see, we are a textile arts museum located in Liberty Station in San Diego, California. We are thrilled to welcome the Storytellers of San Diego back to our galleries.
The exhibition Shifting Tides features 46 artworks by members of the Studio Art Quilt Associates' 7 Pacific-facing regions. The exhibition focuses on the current state of the Pacific Ocean, whose life-sustaining waters are threatened by human activities. The artists explore a range of stylistic approaches and address a variety of issues affecting these waters and the communities that rely on them. Some appreciate the beauty that exists, while others focus on the brewing troubles, addressing questions to ponder and calling for action. Also on exhibition, sprinkled throughout the galleries, are Beth Blankenship's thread vessels of her show Connecting Threads. Beth Blankenship's sculptural works of interconnected threads speak to the unpredictability and vulnerability of our world. She shines a light on ocean health and the status of marine life. To check the museum's opening status and hours, view the online galleries, find textile-related projects and activities, shop our museum store, donate, or to become a member, visit visionsartmuseum.org.
Hi, my name is Kristinha Maria Reva, and I'm going to be telling you a story today in conversation with Beth Blankenship's exquisite fiber art vessel piece, Salmon Tales, which illustrates the life cycle of salmon. Now, Beth is from Alaska, and I know that the indigenous peoples there have a great many tales about salmon. Stories like Salmon Boy and Fog Woman from the Tlingit people, which reveal how foundational salmon are to both ecosystem and culture. So, inspired by Beth's work and these Alaskan salmon tales, I would like to share with you today a story from one of my own ancestral traditions, a story from Ireland that shows the reverence for and understanding of the inextricable connection between salmon and humans. And that story is Fionn McCool and the Salmon of Knowledge. Fionn was wandering. Fionn was wandering as he had been wandering his entire life. You see, he had been made a wanted man whilst still in his mother's womb. That moment, Gol McMorna killed his father, the fierce leader of the famous Fianna warriors. His mother gave birth to him in exile and entrusted him to the care of 2 Druid women, wise to the ways of the woods. And they raised Fionn well, teaching him to be fleet of foot, sharp in mind, and keen in vision. But of course, there came a time when Fionn needed to leave the women, for Gol McMorna had heard talk of the fair-haired youth of the forest, and he knew his rival's son was still alive. And so Fionn turned to the south, and he wandered to the edge of the untamed sea. And there in that southern land, in the company of kings and chieftains and men, he learned the crafts of war and the ways of the world to which he had not yet become attuned to in the woods. And after a few years, Fionn knew it was time for him to return to his homeland. But there was just one thing left to do, and that was to learn the art of poetry. And while that might sound strange to us, in that time it was understood that it was not enough for a warrior to know how to fight. A warrior had to train his mind to the cunning of language and the cadence of meter. For it was understood that strength without eloquence was untempered. And so Fionn turned his attentions to the north, and he wandered, following the waterways, until he found himself at the banks of the river Boyne and the hut of the poet sage Finnegas. Fionn began his apprenticeship to this great old man, tending the man's hut in exchange for instruction. And as he took care of the fire at night, he would ask his teacher a great many questions. "Master, why is it you live on the banks of a river?" "Because flowing water reveals poetry to the mind. One must wait for a good poem, just as a fisherman waits for a good fish." Finnegas had been patient for poems, and he had caught a great many. And he had also been patient for a fish, a very special fish, known as the salmon of knowledge, through which it was said that one could gain the gift of all knowing. Finnegas had been the one prophesied to catch this fish, but for 7 long years it had eluded him. Well, when Fionn learned that his teacher was the one prophesied to catch the salmon of knowledge, he was elated. And of course, he had some questions. "Master, how is it the salmon comes into this knowledge?" "It is said that the salmon gains its knowledge by eating 9 nuts of the sacred hazel tree, whose boughs overhang the river." "I see. But teacher, if that is so, then why not just track the tree?" "That is a very good question, Fionn. But you see, the sacred tree can only be found once one has already gained its knowledge. That knowledge which is contained in the hazelnuts, which fall into the river, which then are eaten by the salmon, and then one day that salmon will be eaten by a man. And that man is you," said Fionn. He was so proud of his teacher. Fionn. All is as it should be. All is as it should be. For you see, knowledge flows through relationship, of tree to river, and river to fish, and fish to man. For that thing we call wisdom can only be gained by the relating of one being to another in the great web of life. Well, Fionn, he was eager that his teacher might finally catch this fish, and he felt the passion of his youth press up against his patience. But considering his teacher's words and carefully sculpting the hearth fire, he said simply, "Well, we must then wait for the fish." one afternoon, Finnegas returned to the hut and placed his round fishing basket on the table before Finn. Inside was a salmon. Inside was the salmon. Finn knew as soon as he looked into the eye of the fish, which opened for him like a portal. Through this eye, Finn could see that the fish carried its own history, that ancient knowing of river and sea. But he also sensed that that fish might carry his own story, the story of his people, that somehow that salmon before him was his own great hook-jawed ancestor. And the salmon's still moist eye stared back at Finn, as though it could still glimpse the future. Finnegas observed Finn with love, and his eyes grew moist with their own waters. I'm going to step out for a bit, Finn, and I'll trust you to prepare the salmon. Gladly, gladly, master. And Finn began to prepare that fish carefully and well, turning it slowly over the flame. But just when he had judged it almost done, this uglyish blister bubbled up on the salmon's side, and unthinking, Finn took his thumb and pressed it down to smooth that unsightly blemish. And as soon as he raised his thumb to his lips, something shifted inside of him. And instead of tasting the savory flesh of the salmon, his mouth was flooded with the salt tang of the sea, and his ear could discern the distant womb cry of a whale. And the murmurings of poetry Finnegas had not yet taught him. And when he looked down at his own hands, even they looked strange to him, older somehow, as though they might not quite be just his own. Well, Finnegas walked in at just this moment, and observing how his pupil's countenance had changed, he asked him, "Finn, did you eat the salmon?" No, master, I would never. I know this fish belongs to you, although I did accidentally taste it. And he told his teacher about the thumb and the blister. And Finnegas listened and took this in and nodded. Well then, I can see that it is done. What is done? What is done, master? Finn, as I told you, I was the one prophesied to catch this fish. But I can see now that you are the one destined to eat it. What are you talking about, master? You have waited for this fish for 7 years. Here, please take it and eat. No, Finn, no. For you see, just as I have taught you to the limits of my learning, so must I live by the limits of what has been ordained. Finn, you are the one meant to eat this fish. Finn received the fish, and gratefully he ate it from tip to tail. And when he was done, he stood up inspired and orated his first perfect poem. And Finnegas looked upon his pupil, a proud, proud teacher, at the end of his life, smiling upon all he had given away. After that, Finn was finally able to return to his homeland and reclaim his birthright, becoming like his father before him, the fierce leader of the famous Fianna warriors. And whenever he found himself in a bind, all he had to do was take that thumb and put it toward his lips. And as soon as he would do so, he would be again flooded by the knowledge of that salmon. That knowledge that had flowed from tree to river, from river to fish, and from fish to man, as it should be in the great web of life.
This tale, SHEN of the Sea, is told in tandem with the dynamic artwork by Nancy Bardish entitled Rising Tides. In old China, along the northern coast, the 7 SHEN, the demons of the sea, got together exclaiming, "We are mighty, aren't we? Oh, yes, we are. We need more sea." For in those days, the sea was very narrow and tall. And so they swam to find some land to overtake. The first land they swam to was that of Kusang. And it wouldn't do. There were jagged and tall mountains. They swam some more, and they came to the coastline of San Shenshan, which was dominated by a great land shen, fierce. "No, we can't stay here. We'll displease the land shen." And they swam further, and they came to a coastline and saw a seawall and looked over, and down below was a low-lying plain, the plain of Watian. "Yes, this suits us." They clambered over the seawall and dropped down and dipped their toes into the early morning dew and kicked up their feet and spewed the dew all over the palace roofs. While the king was walking in the garden, he spied these creatures. He knew they weren't human. Why, they had wide mouths like codfish and glittering iridescent scales. And they were small in stature. And when he came toward them, they did not kowtow. He called out to them, "What manner of men are you, and what's your pleasure?" His heart was heavy. He knew what they wanted. They came to him. "We will overtake your land. For our sea, we are mighty." "Oh, well, when will you do this? For I have 500,000 inhabitants in the city, Cumhaill, and I must lead them to a high peak where I can count them in safety." Oh, they looked at a cypress tree. Now these SHEN were merciful at this moment, and it is said in Chinese medicine that SHEN can be interpreted as spirits. And they thought, "We will flood when the cypress tree blossoms. We will." "Ah," said the king. And then they started complaining. "We are itchy and dry. Where is water for us to spend our day?" Well, the king replied he was sorry that it was so dry out, but here is a bowl containing a sacred lily, and in amongst its roots there are precious topaz and sapphires. Here, take this, take the water in this bowl. No, it's too small for us. Too little water. Huh. If you are SHEN, hence magicians, make yourselves smaller and fit yourselves in the bowl as rubies. My courtiers will be enchanted. First they were very dubious, but after a few minutes, the king saw that the 7 SHEN had become 7 red rubies in the bowl. Quickly, he got a cloudy bottle of jade, and he unstoppered it, and he put in all 7 SHEN as quickly as possible, and stoppered the bottle, went to a remote storeroom at the edge of his property, opened the cupboard, and put in the bottle on the highest shelf. He went back to his garden. Ensued many years of peace. Many inhabitants joined the ones already there because they had heard of the just rule of the king Chiachun. Now, on one particular day, 100 nobles had come with their retinues and entire staffs, and the court was hard-pressed to find enough food or water or drink and entertainment for them. And there's one inexperienced servant, and he wandered to the edge of the property. You might know. He came to the old storeroom, and on that high shelf, he saw the bottle. He couldn't see inside, but he shook it. Ah, it rattles. Rock candy. Excellent. And he unstoppered the bottle. Out rushed the 7 ruby SHENs. The king came by. Well, what have you done? But then he composed himself, and he went down to his garden, thinking, the SHEN will keep their promise. And in this low-lying plain, the cypress trees never bloom. Then, to his horror, he saw the servants of the nobles washing their fine and colorful brocades and hanging them on the cypress tree. The SHEN mistook the colorful garnets for blossoms. They ran back to the sea, and on their heels they brought a surging and violent sea, which breached the walls of Watien. The king had just enough time to flee through the city calling out, and he took perhaps 1,000 inhabitants, and there they fled to the tallest mountain peak. He looked back at the surging waves, and on the white caps he saw the other inhabitants and their animals that belonged to his city, drowned. He was overcome with grief. He stayed on the mountaintop, meditating, deep in thought and thinking, meditating and thinking. And then he knew what he must do, and he went down to where his palace once stood, built a small hut. He gathered materials, rice paper, ink, brushes, and a crystal bowl with a sacred lily. There he started to write kanji, characters, meaningless, all and meaningless diagrams, and he watched the crystal bowl. Within minutes, 7 rubies appeared. Now you might ask about the naivete of these SHEN, who are doing the same thing and expecting different results, but their greed was such they would risk all. He got a jade bottle, and he unstoppered it and put in 6 SHEN and stopped it up and had a hole dug deep into the earth. And then the 7th SHEN was just a little fellow. Ah, Go back to the sea and take your portion of it back with you. If you ever return, I shall destroy your 6 brothers. This is a warning. Go. And the sea never again breached the wall of Watian. And now there's another small story about our 7 contemporary SHEN. And this tale is told in tandem with the compelling and surreal artwork by CATHY MIRANKER called WHITHER, the Waterfront. And both NASA and the EPA and many other agencies and people agree that today a large part of our warming of the sea and sea rise is due to human activity. And so it is up to us as humans to be able to devise a way to containerize some of this usage. And here it is in order. First is electricity, then transportation, then industry, then residential and commercial use. That's us. Agriculture use. That's cows, mostly, and a couple of pigs. And then there's land use and forestry. Agriculture is actually next, and that was the cows. And then there's land use and forestry. And right now, there is a net sink from the Amazon and the other forests who take in more CO2 and emit more oxygen. And if that changes through fires that are set continually in the Amazon, this will reverse itself. Now for the 7th SHEN. The 7th SHEN, which comes and goes, is of our natural sea fluctuation. And some of this comes once or twice a year in the form of king tides or spring Parisian tides. And these are both predictable and predictive of tides in the future and are being studied. In addition to this, there is the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is being studied especially on the coast of the West Coast in California. And that has to do with every 5 to 20 years, the warming and cooling of the tides fluctuates. In the last decade, there have been warming tides. And in plans for the San Francisco area, there are plans to increase the wetlands to mitigate these fluctuations. We hope that the 7th SHEN is merciful as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Aunt Leanne. I'm a professional storyteller with Storytellers of San Diego. So delighted to be here at Visions Art Museum in Liberty Station and to be part of this collaboration with the museum, made possible in part by the Chinese Women's Association grant. We'll be doing a series throughout the year. This particular exhibit that I am part of is called Shifting Tides. And I only recently discovered this museum. I am so delighted to find it. I love textile arts. I love the textures, I love the colors, the things that cloth and other materials can only bring to certain artworks. The artwork that I'm standing next to right now is a quilt called Help Me by Diane Barteling. And it reminded me, I don't know if you can see the plastic ubiquitous rings that used to be everywhere. And it reminded me of the first person who ever taught me to snip those so that sea turtles wouldn't be caught in them. She said, not only is it a good thing to do, but it's a good thing to look for in potential boyfriends, because then you'll know that they're caring, thoughtful people. Then she married a scuba diver, so I think it worked out for her. I'm going to tell you a story from the Fiji Islands, and this one comes from Kadavu, which is also called Turtle Island. Turtles, turtles in the sea. Sea turtles, turtles, come to me. Princess Raudelise and her mother were on their way to one of the outer islands. Raudelise's mother was not the kind of queen who sat in a hut and had people wait on her. Oh no. She was strong with broad shoulders and big arms for fishing and climbing coconut palms and bringing down their fibers and those nuts that were so important to her people. Today they were going out to one of the furthest islands to bring in fish that was growing short near Cottevaux. As they were rowing together out to the island, Raudelise grew tired and put her hand into the sea, dipping in its turquoise, green, gold, and blue colors. She spotted a sea turtle. Mama, look. At that time, the turtles never came on land. They only saw them in the ocean. Ah, that's one of our siblings, Raudelise. Our family has a special connection. You must learn the songs to call them. Vanue wasa, wasa, la komai rei. More and more turtles began to swim on either side of their boat as they made their way to the island. When they got there, they both were hauling in the nets one after another, and they got a very good catch. And then Raudelise began to look for shells along the shore as her mother climbed the tall palms. They each had a beautiful shell necklace, matching, made of puka shells, royalty. But in addition to jewelry, their people used the shells for musical instruments or to call on the conch shells, and many of them had other practical uses as well. When Raudelise grew tired, she lay down to drowse on the beach. Mama, she said, sometimes I wish I was a sea turtle. Her mother had come down from the trees and cuddled up from behind her daughter and whispered in her little daughter's seashell ear, oh, Raudelise, sometimes I wish I were a sea turtle too. Raudelise fell asleep, and the next thing she knew, she was being shaken awake by her mother. Quickly, get in the boat, look! And there on the horizon was a big boat headed toward their island with lots of men from another tribe, tall and short, but there was one who was the tallest who seemed to be in charge. Quickly, quickly! Raudelise and her mother rowed as fast as they could away from the island, but they didn't stand a chance. The bigger boat was much faster. The men jumped aboard and tied up the little girl at her hands and feet, and her mother as well. Raudelise stood up to them and said, you will never get away with this. Our people will find us. And her mother said, hush. But my daughter speaks the truth. Our people will come after us. The tall man grinned an evil grin and ripped the shell necklaces from Raudelise and her mother and threw them into their boat. And then the men tipped it over and shoved it into the current. They'll think you were lost in the strong sea tides. Come, my king will be so happy that we have captured you. Raudelise, now is the time to sing, said her mother. And Raudelise began with her little voice. And her mother joined her. La ko mai rei wasa, la ko mai they sang. A storm blew up all around the boat. Clouds darkened the sky. The wind grew stronger and stronger, and the waves began to bounce that boat along like a bauble on the sea. Now, Denise, you must jump. She heard her mother. She jumped into the sea, and as she hit the water, the vines loosened from her wrists and ankles, and her arms and legs became flippers. And she discovered she had a shell on her back, and her body and face had changed. And there, next to her, that large turtle was her mother, who had transformed as well. She looked behind her as the boat they had been in capsized, and the men sunk to the bottom of the ocean. The next morning, on the beach at Cumhaill, the women had gathered. They found the royal necklaces and the boat shattered, and they began to mourn. But one little girl said, "Look, look, there are turtles coming to shore." It was true, a big turtle, and her little daughter beside her. They came right up onto the beach, and then to the islanders' astonishment, the larger one began to speak. "Oh, my people, this is your little Princess Raudelise. We have transformed into the shape of our siblings, and we shall remain with them. But you must learn the song of the turtles so that you can call them. They may have need of you, and who knows, one day you may have need of them." And they say that from that point on, once a year the villagers gather at the top of a tall cliff and sing the turtles up out of the ocean to the beach where they lay their eggs. And who knows, someday they may sing the turtles out to help them. Wadue wasa wasa lakomai